Well, welcome back to the third part of our conversation series that we're having today. My name is Katie Howard, and I am a nonprofit consultant. I've worked in this field for 20 years, consulting with nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. And I've been having a conversation with Skye, who is an HR expert, because we have seen some really new needs to navigate uncharted territories as COVID-19 has been taking place in our communities. And so Skye, will you introduce yourself and give us a disclaimer, and then we'll just get right into part 3 of our conversation.
Absolutely. I'm Skye Mercer. I'm a certified HR consultant, and I specialize in helping nonprofits all over the U.S. navigate anything with regard to employees and employment matters, HR strategies, and leadership. And a couple of disclaimers before we get started. We want to make sure that folks know that this is by no means legal advice. Neither of us are lawyers, and also that laws vary by state. And so depending on which state you operate in, the law may be different or apply to your organization differently. And then also that this information is as of April 1st, 2020. And right now we are in unprecedented times where information is just coming at us almost daily and changing rapidly. So we want to make sure that folks know that just because it's the circumstance today, things might change tomorrow.
Thank you for that. So part 1 of our conversation was focused on the information and basic facts of the HR. So we covered things like layoffs and furloughs and reductions and lots of different questions like that. So if you're here for some baseline HR information, we encourage you to go back to part 1 of the conversation. Part 2 was focused on decision making and really the how of how do I decide when to lay off or who to lay off or how to lay off. We ended up covering a little bit about volunteerism. So I think that's something, if you have employees who are like, I'll just volunteer my time, I would recommend that you listen to part 2 of this conversation, because the answer to that would be like, no, you won't. And we also covered quite a bit in decision making related to funders and donors and the way that they will fit into the decisions that you make based on the relationship that you have and the conversations you'll have with them. And then this is our third conversation where we're really focused on relationships, it's particularly relationships with employees, so that we can maintain our relationships with the purpose of retention if there has been the unfortunate step of needing to take a layoff approach for right now. And so Skye, I wanted to start by really asking you questions about, it's really about the how. In fact, so much of what I've been feeling over these last many weeks, or I guess it's like, maybe we're only in week 3, I can't remember. It feels like it's been 30 years. But so many of the nonprofit organizations who I've been talking with, we always are focused on your mission is your why. And there's also, though, within our mission, our how. And so we're really carrying out our mission in the ways that we treat our workforce and the ways that we have relationships with our workforce. And so this is an opportunity to really emulate the values of our mission as we're navigating these very difficult decisions. And so what I want to know from you and your HR expertise is, what would I say to my employee if I'm having a layoff discussion? And how do I make sure that I'm providing them with the information and the resources that they need so that they're able to have the best chances of accessing unemployment during this time?
Yes, this is such a good question. And I love how you started it, that really leading from your mission and from your values in how you handle the employment conversations with your employees is going to be so critical. One of my favorite nonprofits I ever worked for, diversity, inclusivity, and respect were core values. And so those values were infiltrated into written materials and discussions with employees at all levels. And so during the conversation, it's important that leaders acknowledge and empathize the emotions and the fear, however, that the leaders really find an outlet somewhere outside of their employees, maybe outside of the organization, to really get their own emotional support. So on one hand, you really want to empathize with the employee. I know that this is a difficult discussion to be had because we reviewed your position, and your position is impacted in in the following way. So notice I said position, because really when you're looking at a layoff, a RIF, reduction in force, or a furlough, which we talk about in video 1, that it's the position, not the person. And then to provide them with as much information as you can, authentically, but not feeding into fear. So, or making overt promises. So things that are helpful to say are, your job is you're being laid off. Our hope is to bring folks back by XYZ date. However, we're going to reassess things as the time arises. Here are some strategies we've already tried, really, because the reason that we're making this decision is because we want to be able to sustain our organization or operation. So it's having a discussion of, here's why we're having this conversation, here's how you're impacted, and we really empathize with that. And then here's what we know right now. We know that this is the date that we're hoping to recall you. However, we cannot guarantee that. The other thing that I think is so important in what I call respectful layoffs is to have good written tools. And in the Helpkit for this webinar, we provide some examples of not only a letter to provide your employees, but a follow-up FAQ or handout to give your employees. They are going to want to know things like, where do I go to apply for unemployment? So provide them with the website and the phone number. They're going to want to know, when's my last paycheck? Will I be paid out for my vacation time? How are my medical, dental, retirement benefits handled during this time? And then also, one of the key things that I think is really important is for nonprofits, if you have an employee assistance program, to make sure that that's available, an EAP available to your employee. And if not, to let them know about community resources that might be available to them. Because getting laid off or having your job impacted is a significant financial impact and can be very heartbreaking. So I think, explaining why, explaining what you've done, and providing tangible fact-based resources for them is going to be very important.
So thank you. That's really helpful. And it brings up some questions for me that I don't know if you can answer or not, but I'm curious if you can. I'm just envisioning a world where, very difficult decisions are made and positions have been affected. How would you recommend that an employer respond if they're getting, lots and lots and lots of questions? Maybe a person thought that they asked all their questions, but then all of a sudden they have 50 more questions. And do you have any suggestions about just how to continue to be responsive and supportive after that, while also, recognizing that there's only so many hours in a day?
Yes. So what I find first and foremost is when you use, fortunately or unfortunately, I've had a lot of experience with layoffs. Mm-hmm. And what I have found over my period of time, 17 years of handling downsizing, layoffs, and different things, is that when you provide a written resource, the questions tend to be fewer. So I noticed that a lot of organizations don't provide that handout that I mentioned, and then it just creates a flood of questions. However, there are still going to be people who really have a lot of questions. And so I think setting aside the time individually to discuss, here's how you're impacted, and have the conversation we just talked about. And also to give them a point person in that handout for follow-up questions. And I think once folks see the handout and really hone in on, okay, here's some sample verbiage I could use, you'll see the messaging that you need to keep coming back to with employees. And yeah, the questions can be tough. And I recommend, having these conversations with people about their individual circumstances, but also having multiple modes of communication with the entire organization without perpetuating fear. So that's a very tricky thing to do, making sure that you're empathizing and acknowledging the uncertainty in an authentic way in your communications with employees, but not overly causing fear, not overly causing additional worry, but more of a here's what we know, here's what we're doing, and here's who you can go to talk to about your questions or concerns, or come to me as the ED or whoever's sending the communication. So I think that it's really similar to a lot of what you've said about donor strategy and funding strategy. It is strategic in that you need to make a communication plan and talk with your employees individually as a group, and then also send different types of communication. And then I would say, making sure that you keep each person's individual circumstances confidential.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that reminder. Our people are so precious to us, and I think it's even harder to know exactly how to navigate that when you have relationships with the people who you employ, and it can just be really tricky. But I love what you said, the reminder that having things in writing is so crucial, because when people are getting news that is very stressful news, our cognitive processing and our ability to remember things is severely impacted. And so I even would say that, based on just my experience with public teaching, that sometimes when I'm trying to share something with somebody, I might tell them everything verbally and then give them the papers at the end, so they're not trying to read and listen and process all at once and take in bad news. And I don't know if that is how you would recommend it, but it's just an idea that occurred to me.
I think that's a great recommendation. And the other way that I've seen it done too, and it really just depends on the person's communication style, the employee's preference. I've also seen where leaders give the information and say, I want you to take a moment and read through this. And then I'm here to talk, and I'm here to process and answer your questions. And then they give the individual time to read through it. They're both good practices. I think that the important thing being that the person knows that you're there for questions and that you're being authentic. And in the nonprofit world in particular, because we work with so many good-hearted folks in the nonprofit community, being very careful that you don't over-promise. So, being realistic with people, we are going to look at bringing you back on this date. However, things might change. I cannot guarantee it. If by chance, and we include this in the Helpkit, if you do find other employment, please let us know. But we really would like for you to stay with us, but we understand you have to do what's best for you. And then the other thing that we mentioned in video 1 as well is making sure to not promise, any sort of benefits that are, outside of your control, like unemployment or how health insurance works, that type of thing.
Yeah, so it sounds like this is really about thoughtful, careful, strategic, and well-planned communication, so that when you get into that moment as the person who is needing to present that there's a layoff happening, that you are prepared to stay on point, so that you don't accidentally make a promise that you really can't make.
Right.
And I just know that, again, this really comes because this is about relationships, that it can be so hard to stay on your message when you're having a conversation that's related to a relationship. And so giving yourself the time to be prepared for that feels really important. So there was another question that I really had wanted to ask, which is, and you alluded to this before, which is that so many of our nonprofit organizations right now, might have found that because they have these restricted grants or restricted donations and they can't do any of that work right now, that there is literally no way for them to keep paying their employees and still have an organization, that they have to hang on to that money for when they can do the work. Or conversely, maybe they have all this unrestricted money, but they can't do any work. And if they just keep paying people, then all of a sudden they won't have any money left, and then they won't have a mission anymore. Because the fact is, when you deplete every last penny and every resource that you have, then the mission has been depleted. Right. So that means that as we've had to make these really difficult decisions, and we're seeing that there are nonprofits who have to, the question that we're hearing so much is, how can I maintain this connection and engagement with my employees during the layoff? because it's not that I plan to rehire them. It's that I am, as you know, the leader of this organization, know that without them, you know, I know we're really talking about positions, not people, but I also think we need to acknowledge that, like, the people who are in those positions are dear to us and are crucial to doing the work. And so how can I, as an employer, do everything in my power to appropriately engage with them, to retain them during the terms of that layoff, so they don't end up not coming back?
I love this question, and you're so right. These are human beings, people that we've developed relationships with and possibly worked with for decades. I talked with an executive director recently who had started the organization, and some of the employees had been there since the beginning of the organization, and it was going to be suspended for a period of time. So it is so important to maintain consistent communication within the employee's preference during the time, so that they're separated from the organization, whether it be a temporary layoff, a temporary furlough, you know, to maintain that contact and to have a strategy for maintaining that contact, a timeline, if you will. So some of the things that I would recommend is periodic emails, if the employee prefers email communication, periodic phone calls, if the person prefers a phone call. There are going to be some employees that are like, please just leave me alone. I just want to be left alone and grieve, and that's okay. And so just like you wouldn't, you know, recognize employees exactly the same, you know, that recognition should be individual. If somebody doesn't like to be called out in public, you don't want to call them out in public to recognize them as an employee. So just like with that, there are employees that are going to prefer different modes of communication and checking in. And so I think it's an important question to ask, to say, here's my intention. I want to stay in touch with you. However, what is the best means for me to stay in touch with you? Because I want to do it in a way that's respectful to you. And so here's what I propose. Here's some ideas I had, you know, whether it's text, email, phone call, or all three, or a periodic lunch date every month or two. I mean, it really depends on the relationship, depends on the employee. But the one thing I would say is that whatever the employee says back to you, what they prefer, and what you need to do, you know, meeting in the middle, they're collaborating on that communication, but definitely hold up your end of the bargain. So if you say, I'm going to be checking in with you weekly, or as more information becomes available every 2-3 weeks, you know, and at any time you can reach out to me, definitely do it. Put it on your calendar and do it. Because if you don't, that is a critical mistake in terms of damaging a relationship with your employee.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a breach of trust when people are already feeling like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And then if you promise that you're going to talk to them in a week and they don't hear from you, I can only imagine that that could be doing a lot of irreversible harm. And it actually brings up a related question that I have, which is, we are in a time where we hear words like diversity and equity and inclusion. And sometimes when we hear those words, they're literally just words. They're not actually practices. And so do you have some suggestions for nonprofit leaders about how they can really embody equity and diversity and inclusion, but especially equity as they're keeping their relationships, and we didn't talk about this in decisions, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't forget, because really we should always be leading with equity. So can you respond to that?
Yes. So, you know, there's a bigger need, an issue with regard to looking at the decisions you're making with regard to equity. And in some of the ways I've heard people talk about, well, you know, hourly versus exempt employees, and really making decisions from a place of making sure you don't inadvertently or directly impact any group of people. The other thing that is very important in not only that macro decision, but in the micro communication, is inclusivity.
Mm.
and meeting the person where they're at and where their preference lies. And
Mhm.
so, and learning from the individual that you're talking to, not approaching it from a method of, I'm in the position of power and here's what I say and here's how we'll communicate and here's how this layoff's going to go, but rather, here's the information. Tell me what I can do to support you. Tell me
Mm.
what you need right now. And really coming at it from honoring different people's traditions, different people's communication styles,
Mm.
and honoring the fact that in the conversation and in the layoff itself, inclusivity is of the utmost importance.
You bring up a good point here because, and this is why I'm glad that we're talking about this as relationships, because no group of people are a monolith. So you wouldn't say, oh, all hourly employees need this kind of approach and all salaried employees need this kind of approach. And that would be true for anything that you're doing within these relationship-based conversations that we're having with our team, if we're needing to navigate a time of layoff. So I appreciate your thoughts to that. I just wanted to mention a couple of small things related to the relationships that we have with our donors and our funders. We talked a lot about how we would have conversations with them in terms of the decision-making process, but I think that there's a really big need to have communications with our donors and funders as part of after the decision is made. And so, keeping your donors in the loop, if you've needed to do a round of layoffs, tell them around the same time that it's happening. Don't let them hear it from somebody else. Let them know how you made the decision and when you're hoping to be able to resume your, to do your rehiring. Same thing with funders. Part of the decision-making process that we talked about was having conversations with funders about how they can unrestrict their funds. And if they can't unrestrict their funds, I would be having conversations with them about, okay, well, here's what the impact's going to be on workforce reductions temporarily, and here's the lag time that we're going to experience as we need to rehire people or bring them, I don't actually know the language to use, but when we re-engage them and they're back into their full-time jobs or part-time jobs, make sure that your funders really understand the delays that can happen in resuming or ramping back up into full service provision. And so that's, I think, another part of the relationship that we didn't talk about during the decision-making process. And then the last thing I would say is, none of us know what's happening in the next week or 2 weeks or 10 weeks. And so I like to think about the fact that if you have a real relationship, nothing is one and done. That it's the longevity of the relationship that is the relationship. And so you wouldn't have a conversation with somebody like a donor or a funder one time and then never talk to them again. You would, you would keep them in the loop. And if nothing is changing, I'm seeing a real trend right now, actually, with nonprofits and actually specifically with some philanthropic institutions, where if they don't have any news to report or if they haven't made a choice yet, they're just not communicating. And I would say that that is not very relationship oriented. And so sometimes having a communication that says, I don't have any news right now, but I just wanted to let you know that we're still in the same place that we were 3 weeks ago. And we really care about you as our partners to us. And we will let you know when we have more information, but we didn't want to lose touch. I just think that is such a great practice for authenticity in relationship and for keeping that relationship going.
Yes, absolutely. And it's the same for employees. Even if you don't have any more information at the time that you're contacting the employee, as you did when you had the initial conversation, simply reaching out and saying, I still don't have any more information. However, I wanted to let you know I'm thinking of you. Do you have any questions for me at this time?
Yeah, that's so great. And you at the very beginning of this had said, if you're the person who's needing to do the layoff, make sure that you're taking care of yourself and processing the emotions that you have with somebody who's not the employee who you're in the conversation with. And I think the same thing can be said for when you're having your follow-up conversations. It is really important that you as a leader not become isolated in your leadership role. And that if you need to be turning to, hopefully you have board members who you have strong relationships with, where you can really be having emotions, feeling the pain and sadness there's going to be some feelings that are very uncomfortable, that maybe we're not very good at feeling those feelings, but we need to be feeling them and we need to be expressing them, because if we don't, they're going to come out in these other communications in ways that are really counterproductive and very harmful.
Yes, absolutely. Such a good point.
Well, I don't think I have any more questions for you at this time. We know that everything can change at any moment, so who knows, maybe we'll be back filming more of these. But I wanted to end by saying thank you to those of you who have participated in listening in on this conversation. I said at the very beginning of the first recording that this is really meant to be kind of a labor of love. I don't know if I use those words, but I love nonprofit organizations and I care about them so deeply. And because we lead with our mission, we sometimes forget that we also are businesses. And so it's awkward to have conversations about finances and layoffs and all these business decisions that we need to make when we really just want to focus on our mission. But I'm so grateful to you, Sky, for being such an invaluable resource to organizations that are navigating this uncertain time. We'll be releasing a help kit of different documents that will cover a lot of what we've talked about throughout these 3 recordings, and then people will have your contact information if they want to retain your services for support in right-sizing the tools and templates that you provide to them to really be tailored to the nuanced needs of their workforce and their state, because a lot of what we've talked about has been focused on Washington state. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I just am so excited that we had this conversation. I'm hoping that the information is helpful to the nonprofit leaders out there, and the information that you're putting in the help kit as well, the decision-making tool for nonprofit leaders to really decide how to proceed, is extremely helpful, in addition to the templates we talked about. So I'm happy to answer any questions that nonprofits have. I'm happy to help really conduct strategic workforce planning in a respectful way. And I'd love to be of service to any organization that is looking for that type of HR support.
Great. Well, I'm so thankful to you, and I will look forward to the next time we talk.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll be to say, here's how you rehire all your employees.
Right, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sky.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.